Hey, everybody. It's good to see folks. I'm Julia Minson, for those of you who don't know me. This is the Kennedy School Conflict Management and Depolarization Seminar. It is sponsored by the Center for Public Leadership and the Management, Leadership, and Decision Science teaching area. We have continued to run the seminar virtually because it gives us a really nice opportunity to engage with speakers from all over the country and sometimes all over the world and have audience members from everywhere. So today we have Brendan Nyhan, who's a political scientist at Dartmouth. And Brendan is going to talk to us about the spread of extremist information online, which we all need to know more about. Just sort of a couple procedural guidelines. I think we like to have this be more of a discussion than sort of listening to one person speak for an hour. So feel free to jump in with questions. You can raise your virtual hand, you can raise your physical hand. And then Brennan, if you're too busy talking and don't notice a hand, I'm going to rudely interrupt you and call your attention to the fact that there's a question. And so with that, please take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. Appreciate you being here. Thank you, Julia, for inviting me. And yeah, look forward to talking with all of you about the research that I'll be presenting. As Julia said, think of this as very much informal in the seminar style. I don't mind being interrupted at all. In fact, I'd rather have you do it at the time when you have a question about something that's right on the point that I'm describing. Of course, if it's some broader thing that I'd prefer to defer to the end, maybe I'll ask you to wait, but there'll be lots of opportunities for clarification questions as we go along if you do want to jump in. So what I'll be presenting today, let me go ahead and share my screen, is joint research with Annie Chen, Jason Reifler, Ronald Robertson, and Christo Wilson. So this is a true interdisciplinary collaboration between political scientists and computer scientists, trying to bring the best of both worlds to understand this platform, YouTube, that has received much less attention, both from scholars, I think, and the media than it deserves. YouTube is a place that Americans, among other countries, but we'll focus on Americans, spend a tremendous amount of time. And yet we talk much more, for instance, about Twitter than we do about YouTube. And I think that's something that should change. We're going to focus in this paper on a particular set of claims that have been made about YouTube and the harms it may cause. Okay. And I want to be really clear up front on what it is we did and what we hope to be contributing. Okay. So what we're interested in are the set of claims about the potential radicalizing effects of YouTube. There's a claim that's been made that people are vulnerable to falling down so-called rabbit holes on YouTube, and that the platform serves as a kind of engine of radicalization or extremism. So a process we worry a lot about for obvious reasons, given, for instance, various kinds of political and extremist violence in recent years. And it's also, of course, a topic that's very germane to the theme of this seminar. The problem is these claims are almost entirely evidence-free. They typically consist of a series of anecdotes describing one or more people and the YouTube consumption they engaged in and what attitudes they express afterwards. Typically, this is gathered by a journalist, or in some cases, it's just simply asserted that this process is taking place. Maybe sometimes people report, well, I went to YouTube and it recommended me this video and that video and the other video. But there really is a shockingly small amount of systematic behavioral data examining these kinds of claims. And so that's what we wanted to contribute. It's, of course, impossible for us to see what's happening inside the platform. YouTube knows much more about that. But as far as what's externally known, we think what we're able to contribute is state of the art in the following sense. We observe actual human behavior. Most of what's been done to this point, and I'll describe it to you in a little more detail in a moment, has relied on bots, right? Or humans following a set of pre-specified steps. And what we wanted to see instead is when people are engaged in browsing under realistic conditions in the way that they would in their everyday life, what kinds of videos are they encountering, right? What kinds of videos are they watching on YouTube? Are they of the sort that we might worry have these potentially pernicious effects? And in particular, are they being recommended the kinds of videos that people have suggested YouTube is frequently recommending to people in a way that sends them down rabbit holes and inclines them towards extremism, okay? So we're going to combine this behavioral data with a set of lists we've built of potentially harmful channels that we're going to classify, and I'll describe these in more detail as either alternative channels that are kind of sit at the intersection between the mainstream and the fringe, and truly extremist channels that we think are even more clearly fringe, hateful, or otherwise extreme. And what we find, in summary, is that exposure to these kinds of content is very rare, and it's concentrated among a really small set of people. Okay, so this is not a mass phenomenon. In other words, consuming this kind of really extreme content on YouTube, it seems to be a relatively small set of people. And even within the set of people who ever encounter these, as I'll show you, the proportion of views and view time coming from most people is fairly small. There's a really small subset of people who are consuming a lot of this, right? Most people not at all, and even those who are having contact with it often very little. Okay, so that's the first point. This is not a mainstream phenomenon, it's a fringe phenomenon. Okay. Second, it's not on the slide. The people who do this report high levels of hostile sexism and racial resentment using conventional survey measures. We actually have a prior measure of hostile sexism from 2018. And we can say at least 2 years in advance of when we measure this behavior, these people are already expressing high levels of hostile sexism. Racial resentment does tend to be correlated with exposure to this content as well. Notably, that contradicts the story of naive people encountering this content and falling down the rabbit hole. We can talk about some more complicated stories that one might construct, but to us, it's more consistent with a pattern of people engaging in a pattern of consumption of news and media and information that's consistent with their existing attitudes. Okay. The second point, which builds directly off of that, is overwhelmingly the consumption of these videos we observe is among people who subscribe to the channels in question or who followed external links to it. Both steps that indicate taking an active, that indicate an active pattern of behavior, right? In other words, these weren't people who are being funneled to these videos typically by recommendations, but instead had either opted into the channel in question. We will see in some cases recommendations are being shown to you because you subscribe to the channel. Okay, but that's you having taken that action to subscribe to the channel in question, right? Or people following links, especially external ones, right, from offsite. And we see those coming in from social media, including from the so-called alternative social media platforms. Okay, and then finally, we construct what we think is the first empirical measure of what a rabbit hole, how we might define a rabbit hole, and find it's a incredibly small proportion of all video visits. And I'll make that more specific in a moment. Julia.
Thanks. So I'm wondering, I guess, I started thinking about how you're right, we don't talk about YouTube very much. And I'm wondering, sort of based on your framing, do you think of YouTube as sort of different in important ways than, Twitter and TikTok that we seem to talk about all the time, as far as like, should we be thinking differently about how their algorithms work or how their recommendation works or how socializing works on YouTube? Or is it like an example of this like other broader class of social networking sites?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me offer a couple of thoughts. The first is that video may have unique properties. So of course, it is a social media platform with some of the same affordances as the other platforms, but there might be some specific things about YouTube that might lead us to consider it differently, or to worry in some cases that the threat of the kinds of radicalization I've described are potentially more serious. So first is the video aspect, and I'll highlight two aspects of that. The first is the potential for so-called parasocial relationships with people you frequently watch in video format, that people seem to, in some cases, relate to them as if they are people they know in real life. That may create greater potential for influence, right, than just text on a screen. Right. So some people are watching these videos for very long periods of time. Again, as I told you, it's relatively rare, but for the folks who do mainline it, they may be watching this for hours in a way that has relatively few counterparts for a single source that's operating in text. The second is the scale of YouTube defies human comprehension, maybe to an even greater extent than tech-centric platforms like Twitter and Facebook. There's simply so much content on there. It's extraordinarily hard to monitor. Even watching a single video can take, hours if you're watching some of these long ones, right? The searchability is poor, right? We don't have full captions for all the videos. So the content moderation is terrible by everyone internally and externally, right? So for all these reasons, I would say, YouTube is closely related, but there's at least a prima facie reason for concern, and especially, I think, a reason for worrying that the kinds of ways we've scrutinized the platforms aren't performing very well for that platform in particular. Okay, does that answer your question? Okay. Good. Okay. And Julia's modeling the kinds of interruptions that I am welcoming. Okay. Because we certainly don't need to all sit here and wait. So please do jump in. Okay. So let me just make a little more precise the kinds of claims that we're trying to address in this paper. So you can see here in the upper left an example of the kinds of news coverage I've referred to, where there's a kind of suggestion that on YouTube, people are being funneled down these rabbit holes that are leading them to extremist, hateful, false, conspiratorial content. Okay, so there's often a series of, again, as I said, anecdotes or kind of example paths that have been captured, right, either by the journalist or by people using bots and so forth, showing how that could take place. Okay, then there was a kind of extrapolation from that. Right? This seems to be happening. And the second article there on the right is one of the most prominent examples of it. So Zeynep Tufekci wrote a New York Times op-ed calling YouTube the great radicalizer, suggesting that it was potentially radicalizing a billion, this billion plus people who are using it, right? At this extraordinary scale, right? But there's really no evidence to support those claims. We do know that these kinds of paths were possible. And importantly, YouTube took some steps, they said, to address this. Now, because we know so little about YouTube, I can't tell you exactly when these steps happened or what behavior looks like immediately before these changes versus afterwards, which are, of course, the things we'd like to know if we were to assess the extent of the problem and whether it's been fixed. So what you see at the bottom is this rather vague post Google put up after making these changes to its algorithm in late 2019. Okay, so that's the most recent. Now, these algorithms change all the time, but that's the most recent major algorithmic change. And the data we're going to collect that I'm going to describe to you, we collected in 2020. So after this change. So very importantly, what I want to be clear about is that we don't observe what happened on the platform prior to this change. We don't know exactly how severe the problems were at that time. But what we can tell you is here's what we observed in the period that we collected data in the latter half of 2020. Okay, so what's known to this point? Now, the first point is very important to start with, which is, so whenever you say anything other than bad, platforms are bad, people say, well, aren't you defending them or excusing their bad behavior or whatever? Now, we're scientists, and I don't think we should think about empirical questions like that, but I want to be really clear that regardless of the findings I'm about to describe to you, it's indisputably clear that on YouTube, there are lots and lots and lots of terrible videos and terrible channels where YouTube is not just providing free hosting, but in some cases, subsidizing quite lucrative businesses based around appealing to some of humanity's worst impulses. Okay, so that remains true regardless of the patterns of behavior, consumption, recommendation, et cetera, that I'm going to describe to you. And to say that the problem is not necessarily the recommendation algorithm, at least as of 2020, does not mean that there's no problem with the way YouTube operates. Okay, so I just want to really suggest we separate those two questions. And I'd welcome coming back to that question about the broader set of problems with YouTube and how we might address them given the findings in the Q&A, because I think that's an interesting question to think about.
Brendan, can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
How should we think about YouTube, the varying audience of YouTube, ranging from very sophisticated younger people to less sophisticated older people? And you're drawing, I think where you're leading us to is, a place that I think maybe applies to sophisticated younger people, but maybe less so to less sophisticated older people. Could you just comment on how you guys thought about that, or how that difference in sophistication that correlates with age maps onto the setup for the paper?
Yeah, so we thanks. It's an important point, and as Maya's question suggests, there's a lot of research that in the rise of, for instance, of untrustworthy websites, it was often older folks who were sharing those more often, who may be more vulnerable to them because of lower levels of political sophistication, media literacy, et cetera. I certainly think there's reason to worry about that with YouTube as well. I don't have a large enough sample to be really confident in the age, the differences in by age subgroup. So I don't have any results to show you on that point in particular, but I think it's worth thinking about. Particularly just even the notion of subscribing to a YouTube channel and or following an external link suggests that the kinds of folks consuming this stuff are relatively digitally literate, right? Although, maybe just enough to use those things and not much more. Are you worried more about, let me just ask, are you thinking about like functionality of operating it, or literally like understanding that there's a bunch of dubious stuff online and you shouldn't trust a lot of it?
The latter.
Okay.
I'm thinking specifically of Kevin Munger's work, looking at the digital sophistication of older versus younger consumers of this kind of information. I find that very persuasive. So I'm just curious how you guys have thought about it or how you test it.
Yeah, no, I think one thing that would have been great to have would have been a digital media literacy scale that I don't think was on our survey instrument. And that would have been really helpful to at least get a baseline on this. And just in general, as I'll show you in a second, we recruited these folks from YouGov rather. So they're in an online survey panel. Those panels have gotten much better. They're not nearly as skewed as like Mechanical Turk participants, but you still might worry they underrepresent the least digitally literate folks, right? Because just to join an online surveying panel is a kind of sophisticated behavior in a way. Is that okay for now, Maya? And I'll keep going forward. Okay, yeah, let's return to that though in the Q&A as you see the results. And just to be clear, now there's a bunch of these studies finding that either bots or humans following instructions can sometimes, as they follow recommendation trails on YouTube, arrive at, potentially problematic videos. But I'll just say that, a number of studies find the opposite. So two that we highlight here find the recommendation paths often aren't reaching more extreme kinds of videos, and in some cases are even moving in the opposite direction. So there's one study in particular that looks at the post-2019 algorithm changes and finds in a lot of cases what YouTube seems to be doing is pushing people back from fringe to the edge of the mainstream. So they'd be pushing people from like conservative alt-right type videos towards like Fox News type content. Okay. Now, of course, there are many broader questions we could discuss about the merits of algorithmic recommendations and so forth. But I'll just say, in terms of the simple, stylized rabbit hole story, the evidence is at least very mixed from these bot and humans following instructions style studies. Okay. The other point that I'll raise from prior research is a really comprehensive study by Hassan Marde et al., which doesn't have some of the advantages of ours in terms of the really granular way we're going to be able to look at the content on people's screens. We're actually going to be able to observe whether they subscribe to the channel, for instance, which this study does not. But what they can observe, this study in particular has a very large online sample. And what they see is the people consuming far-right content on YouTube are also consuming far-right content in other contexts, for instance, in their web browsing, right? Which is, again, consistent with this notion that people are seeking out this kind of content across media types rather than being funneled towards it on one particular platform. And they don't observe the recommendations, in the way that we do, but they find no evidence of greater extremity within session, which they suggest as a possible observable implication of a rabbit hole style theory, right? You enter YouTube on a video that's relatively moderate or mainstream, and then over time, you move out towards the fringes. They find no evidence of that within session. Okay, and you can find more details in their article. Okay, two other points of context. First, just in general, digital behavior data suggests that people living in so-called echo chambers are relatively rare as a share of the US population. So my co-author, Andy Guest, finds this using online web browsing data in terms of the slant of the websites that people visit. And then looking more specifically at untrustworthy websites. Both my co-authors and me found this for untrustworthy websites in web browsing, and the Grinberg et al. Group found this in terms of Twitter, who was either tweeting links to untrustworthy websites or being exposed to them, right? Relatively small share of the population doing the vast majority of this. Okay, so what do we do? Well, we started with 4,000 online survey respondents on YouGov. 2,000 were from a general population sample that was weighted and matched to approximate a nationally representative sample. And then we had 2 oversamples to address 2 particular subgroups you might think of as especially significant concern given the set of questions we're examining. First, people who use YouTube a lot, right? Obviously, somewhat, the kinds of folks you might worry about for a study like this. And then second, people who express high levels of what we call negative views on race and gender. So these are people who are scoring very high on a standard measure of racial resentment and a standard measure of of hostile sexism on a survey conducted in 2018. Okay, and basically they completed this survey that asked them a series of questions, and then we offered them very large incentives to install a browser extension with extensive privacy protections that would allow us to observe what videos they visited on YouTube and what the screen was showing them while they were on the site. Okay, and you can see we recruited 1,181, mostly from the general population sample. Julia.
So before you get to results, I'm just sort of like trying to mentally prepare myself for how to interpret them, in the sense that you're characterizing this as sort of like a small number of people who do all the things we don't want people to do. And the New York Times has this op-ed that says billions are getting radicalized, or, whatever silly number they had. Like, what's a number of people that's so small that we don't care? Or like, what's a number of people that's like still small, right? But enough that we're worried. Because I feel like with a lot of these types of things, you only need a few like very excited people to, take up arms and go storm the Capitol. So I don't know if there's sort of consensus about how many we need to worry about.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I appreciate you bringing it up. So the point we'd like to make in this study, given the findings you're about to see, is these are not mass phenomena. This is not a common experience, but at the scale of YouTube or any of the other major platforms, tail phenomena are still large numbers of people in absolute terms. So that's the really important point you all should bear in mind as you think about this. On the one hand, I'm going to be describing to you findings that are suggesting these behaviors are very rare. On the other hand, YouTube scale is so vast that you multiply, a number that big by a small number, and there's still a lot of people, coming out on the other side, right? So I don't want to minimize that point at all. My co-authors and I very much acknowledge and endorse it. We simply want to say, we think people right now are misunderstanding the prevalence of these kinds of experiences. And if we think instead about this as a problem of tail behavior, and in particular, a problem of tail behavior driven by what seems to be mostly selective exposure and consumption by people who have hostile prior attitudes, that changes the kind of set of policy responses you might consider, right? Where I'm using policy here to include what the platforms do, because with the First Amendment, there's not much we can do in a regulatory sense, nor should we necessarily. But it changes the policy questions from moving away from, well, just fix the recommendation algorithms, that's why people have extreme views, to say instead, maybe we should think about the way YouTube provides free hosting to people who are promoting terrible views. And those are being sought out by people who find those views attractive, right? And even if those are small percentages of the population, there's a lot of them, right? There's a lot of people with really extreme attitudes on race and gender, right? And if you can put that online and build a big audience and monetize it, right, that can be really harmful. So that's a preview of how I would think about it, but I'd love to hear more of your thoughts as we get to the Q&A. Here's how we classified the channels. We really tried to err on the side of inclusion. You will note if you ever see papers and research on digital behavior that no one can code the internet is a common problem. Every one of these talks you go to, there's this like, if I only had the classification for each video on whether it expressed, dangerous extreme views, et cetera, right? But, we could watch videos from now to the end of time and never, each of us, and struggle to get through this list. So what we do is we take a set of lists that have been built at the channel level by subject matter experts and academic researchers, okay? And we're essentially taking the superset of those and we're categorizing them into two groups. And I've given you some examples here to try to help you get your head around them. The first is this group we call alternative, that are at this borderline between the mainstream media and the fringe. Most famously, Joe Rogan fits into that category, and that's part of what he's been criticized for, is the way, he has mainstream figures on like Bernie Sanders, and he also has quite fringe figures on. So that's the alternative group. The extremist group is more explicitly extreme, often expressing very extreme or hateful views with regard to race and gender in particular. David Duke, channels that are featured on Stormfront, which is an explicitly openly white nationalist website, and so forth. Okay, so we have those two lists, and we're going to be looking at exposure to each type, to videos from each type of channel. That's going to be our main outcome measure. You can see out of that set of more than 600 channels that 263 of those were viewed by participants in our study, and even after the study was completed, it had been in the field for several months. More than 500 of them were still active. So it's not the case that these are popping up and being taken down by YouTube right away. Although some are. David Duke, for instance, is gone. Okay, so enough talk. Get to the findings. So we find 15% of our participants at least viewed one video from an alternative channel. And just 6% viewed at least one video from an extremist channel. Now, whether you think of those as big or small numbers is, of course, an open question, as Julia's comment suggested. But that's, we think suggests, these are relatively rare as a share of the population, as a share of the kind of behavior on YouTube, which the latter set of statistics clarifies that point even more explicitly, right? As a share of all the views of videos that we observe on YouTube, you can see alternative channels just 2.7%, extremist channels 0.4%. So quite a bit lower than that mainstream media channels figure of 4.6%. And of course, there's this huge other set of videos that are in none of these categories. Charlie.
Yeah, so I would quibble with the numbers.
Please.
Because if you had told me these numbers at the beginning of the talk, I would have guessed that the title of the talk was that extremist videos dramatically overrepresented on YouTube. Because I'm imagining that, 15% of people, like, I'm trying to think what the comparison is, right? If you replace the word alternative channel and extremist channel with other things like sports channels, or movie channels, or book channels, right? And to say that those things aren't on YouTube would be surprising to me. So I don't know, it's hard to decide what words to put with the numbers, but these strike me as extremely high rather than extremely low.
Okay. No, I appreciate that.
Not that my judgment's any better than anyone else's, but I don't know. That would have been my reaction to these numbers. So I'm curious if you can help us compare them to other types of channels on YouTube, and how we should think about, are they overrepresented or underrepresented?
So the only benchmark I have for you right now is that mainstream media list. Now those mainstream media channels, right? Those are sources that are optimized for other media, not YouTube. So their audience is not like the kinds of channels we're describing. These are people focusing all of their efforts on producing content for YouTube, whereas the CBS News YouTube channel is a kind of offshoot of a television business, right? So at the same time, right, those channels have huge reach and brand recognition and so forth. So you might say the fact that they're only attracting double the audience as a share of views of alternative channels, right, is not that much.
Yeah.
And Joe Rogan in particular, right? There's a reason Joe Rogan has people fighting to get on his show, right? Because his audience is huge, as a share of the YouTube audience.
But so I agree with that. But I'm saying if 4.6% is mainstream and 3.1 is alternative and extremist, right? If you told me that 40% of news exposure on YouTube is alternative and extremist channels, right? I think that's a pretty scary number. And so I don't know. I'll shut up now. But I don't know. These strike me as extremely high.
And also, let me just add one additional thought, Charlie, and then I'll go to Julia. The alternative case is a little more ambiguous in the following sense. Like Joe Rogan, you can watch hours of, and you might think is mostly, kind of a bro-y talk show. So how you think about that alternative category, I think views will differ on that as well. The extremist channels is the one where it's clearest, right? For what that's worth. That's why I provided both.
Last comment,
Yeah.
I promise.
Yeah.
If you told me that 10% of news media exposure on YouTube is extremist channels, that's pretty terrifying, right?
So, just to be clear, of course, there's all kinds of news and media content that isn't swept up in this because they're posted by other sources that aren't on our mainstream media list, or they're posted by, people who aren't official broadcasters but have taken the videos from elsewhere, et cetera, right? So the set of news consumption on here is, this is not a proper denominator, but, we provide it for the sake of comparison. So for what that's worth. Julia, and then I want to get to some more results.
Yes, I think understanding the denominator better is really important. So we're talking about a 500 channels or so that have been classified, right? And they're all news channels. Is that right? And we're talking about sort of mainstream versus, I'm thinking about the question Charlie started with, if this was 15% was X. And I was thinking about what X is even earlier before his question. So imagine if instead of extreme news, it would be, because also extreme has this, I think we're specifically talking about sort of gender views, extreme gender views and extreme racial views, right? But what if I believe in fairies? What if I'm way out there and my beliefs are not real, but they don't have a clear political connotation?
Those wouldn't be in this list. Yeah,
but
right.
it feels really.
Oh, I see. So that's another benchmark, in other words.
Right. What's the proportion of people who are watching crazy things on YouTube, but they're harmless crazy things,
right? Astrology YouTube or something, right?
Sure, exactly. So is it a lot more than those people, or fewer than those people?
Fair. Yeah. No, I'll
people. How do they compare to the not angry crazy people?
Yeah, no, I'm going to think about that. I'm going to take that back to my co-authors and think about this denominator issue. Let me just add one more point though, which is actually the next finding. Well, actually two. So first, in terms of whether these people are seeking this kind of content out. Now, of course, what it means to seek something out is ill-defined. So we'll give you some observable indicators, right? So you can see here that relative to these other two, the mainstream media channels I've mentioned to you, or everything else, that alternative and extremist channel consumption is heavily concentrated among people who subscribe to the channel in question, or to a much lesser extent, people who subscribe to another channel in that category, right? So it seems to be the case, in other words, that relatively few people are consuming this kind of content who haven't explicitly opted into it, right? They're coming to it via, a chance occurrence, or in some way that's less directed than actually choosing to subscribe to a channel, saying, not just I like this, but I want to see more of it, right? And I'm telling YouTube to show me more, show me when there's new videos posted. Okay. Those are all normalized to 100%. And that's why we have those percentages at the bottom, just to remind you that even though those bars for alternative and extremists look very large, highlighting here that, this is as a proportion of the total views of content of that type. Okay. Now, this gets back to Charlie and Julia's questions about the share of, how many people are really watching this stuff. Just to be clear here, that we observe extreme skew in consumption of these in terms of the share of the users who are responsible for most of the actual view time, right? So not someone who like opens it and goes, oh gosh, right, and runs away, right? Which we've all had happen to us in some form on the internet, right? So you can see here, this is a non-log scale on the main graph. And it's so skewed that we've put it on a log scale there in the inset to help you see the extent to which it's skewed. So you can see there with the dashed lines are indicating that 1.7% of users are responsible for 80% of the watch time on alternative channels. So that's maybe getting closer to this idea of a really small percentage of people as the core audience for this stuff. And you can see the red line there above the yellow line indicating that 1.7% of users responsible for even more, right? Even more of the extremist view time, right, is coming from 1.7%. Looks like close to about 90% of watch time is coming from, fewer than 1 in 50 people. Okay, so these graphs hopefully indicate the skew that, these are not just things that are watched by relatively few people, although it depends, as you've heard, on how you interpret those top line numbers, but within the set of people who are watching them, right, there's this extreme skew in consumption levels, suggesting that this very small percentage of people are doing the vast majority of the watching of this content. Okay. Now I've told you that these video consumption of these types of videos from these channels, these alternative extremist channels, right, is correlated with hostile sexism. Now, we don't have causal identification here. We're simply looking at correlations between characteristics of our participants and minutes per week spent watching alternative channel videos, extremist channel videos, or mainstream media channel videos. And what you can see there is that when entered into a regression along with a set of demographic covariates, hostile sexism stands out as the strongest predictor of watch time of these particular types of content. By contrasting, and actually contrary to our expectations, racial resentment was not significantly associated with watch time of those types of channels when entered in jointly with hostile sexism, although it is if entered into an equivalent model separately. Similarly, feelings towards Jews are not correlated with watch time of either type of channel. And then finally, in terms of Maya's question earlier, it looks like she had to go. We do find age is positively associated with time watching the extremist channel videos, but there's no significant relationship for alternative channel videos. Okay. And then finally, just to illustrate the point here, these are the predicted values from that quasi-Poisson model that I just showed you on our hostile sexism scale, with that rug plot at the bottom indicating the relative frequency of different values. So 5 is the highest on this hostile sexism scale, 1 is the lowest, and you can see the view time is really only appreciably moving up when we're in that range of 4 to 5, so the very highest levels of that hostile sexism scale. Okay, I've told you that it's often subscribers who are watching these channels. Another question is, well, how else do people get there? And so what we did was look at how what people previously viewed prior to watching a video of these 4 particular types: the alternative channels, the extremist channels, the mainstream media channels, and then everything else. Okay, and what you can see is the alternative channel videos and extremist channel videos that we're most concerned about have viewers who somewhat more frequently than for the other types of videos followed an off-platform link. Okay, so again, this is inconsistent with a recommendation-driven notion. I'll give you more evidence on recommendations in a moment, but in a way, it's another kind of evidence for a kind of intentional behavior. Someone has there's been a link provided to them or shown to them somewhere off platform, and they've clicked it and said, I want to see that. Now, do they know the exact content of the video they're going to see? Not necessarily, right? But there's an active step taken by that user, right? And again, in tandem with the evidence I just showed you about the kinds of attitudes people are bringing to bear when they're thinking about what information to consume, we think this is more consistent with a kind of intentional process of seeking out content that is congenial to people given their existing attitudes. Okay, I was doing the professor pause to let anyone express outrage. Okay, it's quiet.
I'm surprised extremist videos don't lead to more extremist videos. Like, I would think that red bar that sticks out would be much higher than it actually is.
Yeah, so I'll show you evidence that when people are on extremist videos, they're more likely to be recommended other extremist videos. And that's probably what's driving that. But you can see as a share of them, it's still quite small. It actually seems like these off-platform sources are really what's responsible. People aren't watching, at least those data suggest people aren't, in other words, watching them again and again and again in a row, right? Or that red bar in the second set of results there would be much higher. Charlie.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes, like, I'm about to do research here. We'll go watch videos or things from the other side to basically laugh or make fun of them. Right? Like, can you believe the crazy thing that this politician from the other side said, or this person, how extreme they are? Do you have any sense for how much of the views in your data set come from that type of motivation versus kind of like true believers watching this extremist content? I don't really know how you would get at that, but I'm just kind of curious if you have like any way to get insight into that.
Not directly, of course. We don't have. I guess what I would say, an observable implication of that is we should see people who are kind of, like you've heard, like hate watching is kind of a version of this, a term that describes it, right? If that were true, I think for instance, our hostile sexism results wouldn't be observed, or our racial resentment, right? If that were a predominant share of these views, that should be driving those results down to zero or even flipping them, right? And we observe no evidence of that. These videos in particular, it takes it's a lot of work to actually watch them, right? So the kind of hate read is both much more efficient as a use of your time if you just want to get satisfaction out of how wrong the other side is, and much less emotionally taxing than watching someone who you find loathsome talk for many minutes, right? Which I at least find very personally aversive. And I don't imagine too many people are willing to suffer through, an hour of white supremacist video or even 5 minutes. I'm sure those people exist. I wouldn't rule that out. But it doesn't seem to be, a substantial share. We can't rule it out as a portion of this, but it doesn't seem to be the main part of it, if that makes sense. Okay. Now here, what I showed you before, just as a reminder, off-platform links seem to be somewhat more common for the alternative and extremist channel videos. Here's what we observe when we disaggregate that between on and off-platform referrers. So I want to draw your attention to panel B of the figure, where we're disaggregating the off-platform refers. And what you can see is alternative social sites like Gab and Parler are really stand out in driving traffic to extremist channel videos in a way that really has no comparison for the mainstream and other channel videos, and there's only just a little bit of it for alternative channel videos. You can see that mainstream social media, they're sending some traffic there as well, although actually somewhat less for those extremist channel videos compared to the alternative social media. Okay. All right, recommendations, right? So the rabbit hole style story again suggested that people were frequently being recommended these problematic videos. So, and again, just as a reminder for those folks who joined us late, in 2019, Google made what it said were substantial changes to its algorithm. So what I'm reporting to you are what we observed among our participants after those changes were made in 2019. Our data are collected in 2020. What you can see there at the top is recommendations to alternative and extremist channel videos are a tiny percentage of all the recommendations our participants received. 1.4% of all recommended videos for alternative channels, 0.2% for extremist. So just a tiny, tiny fraction of what's being recommended to people. Mainstream media, by contrast, 5.8% of the recommendations. And just note that that's the alternative extremist channel recommendations are lower than the share of watched videos we saw at the very beginning. Mainstream media are higher, right? So it actually seems like the recommendations are tilting the playing field away from the alternative and extremist channels and towards the more mainstream stuff. What you see there down at the bottom, oh, Uma, please.
Oh, sorry about that. I didn't mean to interrupt you mid-sentence.
No, it's fine. I wanted to get you.
I apologize if I missed it. Is there, when you say recommended videos, should I be thinking of this as, you know, sort of the right side column when any other video plays, the ones that appear after completing a video, or the autoplay? I guess I'm just wondering how expansive or specific the description of recommended is, particularly now that we're in the space of, you know, the rabbit hole point.
Yes, thank you. That's a really important clarification. That was worth interrupting. That's why we wanted this. Okay, so I'm talking about the right sidebar. So what we're thinking here when it's existing viewers is someone who has a video loaded up on the YouTube page, and there's on a browser, a web browser, at least on a desktop or laptop, right? You get that right rail or sidebar that has a series of recommended videos. So that's what we're speaking about here. We also capture information on YouTube search and so forth, but the predominant engine of recommendation viewership on YouTube is that right rail. And it's going to autoplay the highest ranked recommendation at the end of your video if you don't do anything. Although we find that's relatively rare too.
Thank you.
And so what you're going to see here, let me just add on that as one more point of clarification. What you're seeing here is what videos appeared in that right rail as recommended videos. What I'll show you next is which ones did they actually click on. Okay, so there's kind of two ways to think about recommendations, right? First, what is YouTube showing to people? And second, what are they actually doing when they're provided with that set of options, which of course they don't have to follow, but you know, people often do, right? That's part of why YouTube is a massive business. Okay, thank you for that. So yeah, so what we're seeing at the top here is the share of the recommended videos that people viewed. Sorry, the share of recommended videos that were shown when people were watching a YouTube video from these particular categories. And we're seeing alternative and extremist channel videos very rarely appear in that list, okay? Importantly, when you move to the bottom part of the figure here, what you can see is that you want to be focusing in on those alternative channel videos in orange and the extremist channel videos in red. And what you can see is when people are watching alternative channels, there's a substantial, a minority, but a substantial fraction of the recommended videos are to other alternative channel videos, and to a lesser extent, extremist channel videos. Similarly, when you're on extremist channel videos appear in the recommendations. There's a substantial minority of your recommendations are to other videos of that type. Okay, but what you can see as you move to the other right panels, which again represent more than 98% of all video views, is that alternative channels are recommended very, very infrequently, and extremist channels essentially negligible as a share of recommendations. So for 98+% of videos people are watching, they're not getting recommendations from these potentially harmful categories. It's really concentrated on the people who are already subscribing, or sorry, I'm going to get to that, who are already watching channel videos of that type or the other potentially harmful type. I hope that was clear. Okay. Here's what they followed. Okay. So again, as I was saying to Uma before, what we saw before was what were they shown? And so now we're saying of the set of cases we observe where recommendations are provided to people and someone follows one of them, right? To what extent are they following recommendations to these types of videos? Okay. Again, you can see the share of recommendations followed to alternative and extremist channel videos is very small, less than 1% of all recommendations followed. And you can see again that those behaviors are concentrated among people who are already watching a video of the type in question, right? So substantial minority of alternative channel followed recommendations to alternative channel videos are for people who are already watching videos of that type, and similarly for extremist channels, right? And then these behaviors are extremely rare to non-existent when it comes to the other channel types that make up 99% of all recommendations followed. Okay. And importantly, when we're thinking about why are people being shown recommendations only when they're already watching a video of that type, what we find is a ton of these are just people who subscribe to a channel of the type in question and are being shown more videos, we think, from that channel, right? They've indicated to YouTube, I want more of this, right? And YouTube has changed its algorithm to push down these so-called borderline types of content. So they seem to be getting recommended very rarely when people aren't watching videos of these types. However, the subscription functionality, YouTube says, that's the user telling me what it wants, and I should give it to them, okay? And that's something I think we should question, but that seems to be driving this. You can see the subscriptions, the subscribers are frequently, are a majority, often a quite large majority of people who are getting these recommendations and following them. Julia.
So this is making me think about like really old 1960s social psych stuff on risky shift and what then became normative shift. And I don't know if you know any of this research, but it's basically, so the original risky shift work was the idea that you put together groups of people and you ask them about attitudes, about different behaviors, some of which were risky. And then after they have time to talk to each other, they endorse the risky attitudes to a greater extent. And so psychologists in the 60s sort of freaked out and said, you know, kind of mob mentality and groups push people towards riskier behavior. And this thing was called risky shift. And then like somewhere in the 70s, it became normative shift. Because it turned out that it wasn't about risky behaviors. It was that any attitude that's held in a group, when you let them discuss it, people take on the majority view more strongly, right? So it's basically group discussion leads you to coalesce around whatever the majority attitude is. And in those early studies, it just happened to be that the majority attitude endorsed the risky behavior. And so what this makes me think about sort of with respect to YouTube is that on one hand, like the people that are writing the New York Times articles, they're imagining risky shift. They're imagining that, you know, exposure to this content and being able to engage with it, like has this psychology that, you know, in the 1960s, psychologists thought existed too. So you know, they're in famous company. But also by the same token, I wonder if like the dependent variable we should be really worrying about is that the people who have self-selected into these communities and now, you know, are being recommended this stuff and now they're watching more and more of it are becoming not necessarily more extreme in their attitudes, but maybe more confident in their beliefs, in their extreme beliefs, right? So it's not that like more people are joining these groups, but the people in these groups are becoming, you know, more extreme and more coalesce around those ideas. Does that sort of fit your data?
We can't evaluate that possibility, but I worry about it. I think that's closer to a plausible threat model than the kind of rabbit hole style story of naive people falling down, that instead you might worry about these people who have extreme views that are not socially desirable and therefore difficult to express in ways that allow you to make common cause. But in an online space, you can actually find quite large subgroups in ways that people have worried about for lots of different kinds of extremists online, right? You can find this group of people who all share your views and who seem quite large. The audience, even for these relatively fringe figures, their videos can be getting hundreds of thousands or millions of views. Their comment sections are cesspools of like-minded people. you could imagine a story where even though those people had relatively extreme views going in, right, that more confident feeling they might be describing could be greater extremism, greater intention to act on their views. You can imagine lots of stories like that. We can't evaluate those with the data we have. But I think our data pushes us towards thinking about that model of extreme attitudes and then potential activation, or feeling like you're part of some larger group. You're not a kind of, or you're some kind of put upon minority that has to defend itself, right? There's different stories you could tell. But I think it's a very plausible case to worry about. Let me just wrap up the results so we can get anyone else who wants to jump in. So rabbit holes, this is a claim people make that has no empirical definition. So the field I work in is plagued by words that no one's ever written down a scientific definition for, like echo chambers. Rabbit holes is very much in that genre. No one's ever written it down. We tried, okay? So this isn't perfect, but we think it's a first approximation of the kind of thing one would expect to observe if the claim about rabbit holes is correct. So what we said was to qualify as a single step towards a rabbit hole. So notably, we're not talking about multiple steps in the full version of the story. We're saying a single rabbit hole style step. How often do we observe it? And what we mean by that is someone was shown a recommendation to an alternative or extremist channel video. They followed it. When they did that, it moved them to a more extreme channel type. Either they were not on an alternative or an extremist channel and they moved to one, or they were on alternative and they went to extremist, right? So it doesn't count, in other words, to move within your category or to move from extremist to alternative. It has to move you out on the extremity scale, okay? So you follow the recommendation to a more extreme channel type and you don't already subscribe to the channel in question. How often does that happen, okay? You can see there at the bottom, we observe it 108 times in our data, okay? So 0.02% of all video visits, 0.002% of all for alternative, 0.002% for extremists. And if you're worried about extremists in particular, you can see 0.8% of all users, 0.002% of all visits, okay? So not zero, and again, scaled at the level of YouTube, lots of reasons to worry even about those tiny percentages, but nonetheless, right, this seems to be an extremely rare behavior. And again, this is a single instance of moving to a more extreme video from a recommendation, not a full progression of multiple videos, nor evidence of an ensuing radicalization based on those series of steps. Okay, I'm gonna just wrap up with some caveats and then some conclusions. First, as I emphasize, YouTube is still responsible for hosting these channels, even if they've changed their algorithm. Okay, and the way in particular, as I've highlighted, their subscription affordance works is something that's worth questioning. As we've emphasized, the platform scale means even tiny percentages can represent very large numbers of human beings. We don't have data prior to the algorithm change in late 2019, and there may be other kinds of rabbit hole stories one could construct that we're not able to assess. Our sample isn't nationally representative. We have to look at channel level data, not video level, because it's impossible to code all the videos on YouTube. Our mobile coverage data is quite limited, so we're really reporting desktop, laptop data. We don't have good data on outside the US. And of course, sometimes people have YouTube open and aren't paying attention to it, and we're not able to distinguish between circumstances when people are paying close attention and when they're not. Okay. But we think we've at least made progress towards helping get a sense of the relative magnitudes here, understanding the frequency of this kind of exposure, and in particular, something important about the audience for these channels and how they get there. This small minority of people who seem to be seeking this kind of content out because they have hostile attitudes, they frequently subscribe to the channels in question or follow links to them. And the rabbit hole style story, by contrast, we find relatively little evidence for. It seems to be a relatively small fraction of the audience. It seems to be responsible for a relatively small, really tiny percentage of all the exposure to this kind of content, right? So if you're thinking about the harm you're concerned about is people watching this kind of content, rabbit hole seems to be a tiny part of that story. And people seeking this kind of content out because they have hostile attitudes seems to be a very large part. All right, I'll stop there. Questions?
So is this better or worse than when you expected going in?
That's interesting. I would say it depends how you think better or worse. I certainly had the experience with the untrustworthy website data of learning about the skew in digital behavior, that it's really, this kind of tail behavior phenomenon are not well understood. So I think that part was not inconsistent with my expectations. I did think the recommendation algorithm would perform more poorly than what we observed, based on what I had heard prior to this and having not worked with YouTube before. And I had underappreciated the role of subscriptions in particular. I think that was the thing I learned the most about. I don't use YouTube a ton. I don't subscribe to any channels. This is not something I'd thought about carefully. And the extent to which that seemed to be this, key part of how these channels build audiences and what YouTube is showing to them when it is showing these recommendations. I hadn't really thought about that. And importantly, that's the kind of thing that YouTube could change. I just want to I also want to, raise questions about the way these platforms work. I think sometimes we're like, well, the thing YouTube has to fix is the algorithm. And we forget all the other parts of the site and the way the platform works, which are all choices instantiated in software that could be changed, right? They could change how subscriptions work if they wanted to, right? They could change how, if you're coming in from really terrible external sites, whether those links will operate. They choose not to, right? And that's a choice and one we should evaluate and hold them responsible for. I would make the claim, going even further, that the algorithm conversation has crowded out the really hard conversation about the points I'm just making, because those folks who are subscribing, they are opting in. And YouTube has to get to that more uncomfortable place of saying, though, even though people have told us they want this content, we're making a choice, right, not to show it to them, right, even though they've told us that they want to, right? And that's a little uncomfortable. Some of these, these platforms don't want to be in that position. But if we're concerned about this kind of content, that's the kind of thing that I think we have to grapple with.
That's interesting. One of the things this is making me think about is that, we've been doing some work in Russia, and what we've been sending Russians is YouTube videos that are, pro-Ukraine coverage by Western media outlets. And one of the things that a lot of the sort of political scientists who specialize in Russia and Eastern Europe are baffled by is why Russia hasn't shut down YouTube the way it shut down everything else, right? And part of the reason is, or sort of the reason that people think it is that it's so fast and people rely on it for everything from their, cat videos to their yoga videos to their, Russian propaganda to their, Radio Free Europe, right? And so the assumption is that it just would be entirely too much backlash if they tried to shut down YouTube the way they shut down other things. But then you flip it, right? Because in Russia, what we think of as mainstream is radical and fringe.
Right.
And what they think of as mainstream, we think of as government propaganda that's, like entirely fabricated. And so if we want YouTube to start shutting down things that are radical and fringe, according to some judgment, we want them to be using our judgment.
Right.
Which gets very confusing fast.
Yes. I mean, all the platforms are facing this, right? India's putting Twitter under tremendous pressure in terms of the content that's shown there. And I have no views on why Russia does what it does. That's not my expertise, but I'm certainly, I think it's interesting. I've heard the same conversation about Telegram, right? That it's both a vehicle for, anti-regime content, but also for pro-regime content. And people use it so frequently that the state has to this point chosen not to intervene. And, to be clear, at least in this case, I have no policy recommendation for legislation or the US government. I think this is a matter of civil society holding and academic researchers holding YouTube accountable. And I think, they've been doing this two-step where most of the time Facebook and Twitter are getting beat up, and YouTube just kind of hides in the corners, like, don't pay attention to us. And then when they do get called out, someone makes sweeping claims about algorithms, and they say, well, that's not true, or a tiny percentage of our recommendations are to harmful content, right? Which, as you've seen from my data, our data suggests that some of those claims are accurate. And then the conversation ends. And people say, no, there's secret black box algorithm. It must be bad in this or that way. And of course, none of this to say the algorithm is perfect or I'm defending it in its current form, simply that a lot of the kinds of claims that have been made, we don't find very strong evidence for. And these other kinds of concerns we might have, there's been almost no public conversation about. A couple of members of Congress brought this stuff up to Google when they came before Congress, after our initial research results were released. But, it was, in very brief, and it didn't really lead to much. And I'll just say, for people's background, that, there's been proposals for greater platform transparency. There is one public policy thing. I said there was no public policy. One public policy issue that has come up is kind of proposals for platform transparency. And there's a bill, there's draft legislation from Coons and Portman that would mandate some kinds of platform transparency. And one thing it might do is provide a more systematic window into the kinds of questions we've been talking about, and help us understand better, what people are seeing and how on YouTube, and hopefully open up some of these other questions besides those about the algorithm.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much. We appreciate the visit, really enlightening talk. And we'll be here again next month with David Hagman. Bye, guys.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.